The clock on the wall showed 4 in the afternoon, and the 3 judges sitting behind the long table looked like they hadn't slept in days. Their coffee cups were empty. Their notebooks were full of crossed-out names, and their patience had run out hours ago. It was supposed to be an exciting day. This audition in Nashville was meant to find the next big singing star, the kind of voice that gives you chills, the kind of talent that makes you forget where you are. But after sitting through nearly 60 performers, the judges had heard nothing but disappointment. The oldest judge at the table had been in the music business for over 30 years. She had discovered some of the biggest names in country music. She had heard thousands of voices in her career, and right now, she was starting to wonder if real talent had simply disappeared from the world. She leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. Her back hurt, her head was pounding, and she couldn't remember the last time she had heard someone sing and actually felt something. Next to her sat Robert, a music producer who had worked with some of the most famous artists in the industry. He was known for being tough. He rarely smiled during auditions, and today his face looked like it was carved from stone. He had stopped writing notes an hour ago. What was the point? Nobody was worth remembering. The third judge was younger than the other two. Her name was Diana, and she had been a pop star herself before becoming a mentor and judge on talent shows. She still remembered what it felt like to stand on that stage, nervous and hopping for a chance. She tried to be kind to every contestant, but even her encouraging smile had faded as the day wore on. The audition hall was large and cold. The stage lights were too bright. The air conditioning hummed constantly, making the room feel empty and lifeless. Behind the judges, a production crew of about 20 people sat watching, waiting, hoping that someone would walk through those doors and save the show. Because the truth was, they needed a star. They needed someone special. Without that one amazing moment that would go viral and get people talking, the whole show would be forgotten, and everyone in that room knew it. The day had started with so much hope. The first few contestants had been nervous but decent. One young man had a nice voice but forgot his lyrics halfway through. A woman in her 20s had chosen a song that was way too difficult for her range. A teenage boy had tried to impress everyone with fancy vocal tricks, but there was no emotion behind any of it. As the hours passed, things got worse. There was a man who thought he could sing opera but sounded like he was in pain. There was a group of friends who had clearly never practiced together. There was even someone who brought a guitar but couldn't tune it properly. One contestant had walked off stage crying before finishing her song. Another had argued with the judges when they offered honest feedback. And there was one memorable performance where someone tried to combine singing with magic tricks, and neither worked out. By lunchtime, the judges had already lost hope. They ate their sandwiches in silence, each of them wondering if they should just pack up and go home. But they couldn't. The show needed content. The producers needed footage. And somewhere out there, maybe, just maybe, there was still someone worth finding. Robert stood up from his chair and stretched his arms. He walked over to the small table where the coffee machine sat and poured himself another cup, even though he knew it wouldn't help. "How many more?" he asked the assistant standing nearby. The young woman checked her clipboard. "About 15, sir." Robert nodded slowly. 15 more chances. 15 more opportunities for someone to walk in and prove that this whole day wasn't a waste. He didn't believe it would happen, but he sat back down anyway. Pulled out her phone and checked her messages. Her daughter had texted her asking what time she would be home for dinner. Looked at the message for a long moment before putting the phone away. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know when this torture would end. Diana tried to stay positive. She reminded herself that every famous singer had once been an unknown person walking into an audition just like this one. Somewhere in those remaining 15 contestants, there could be someone with real talent, someone with a story, someone who deserved a chance. But as the next few performers came and went, That hope began to fade too. A middle-aged man sang an old rock song but couldn't hit any of the high notes. A young woman chose a beautiful ballad but had no stage presence at all. She stood completely still, staring at her feet, and even though her voice was okay, it was impossible to connect with her. Another contestant spent more time talking about himself than actually singing. He went on and on about his dreams and his struggles and how much this opportunity meant to him. But when he finally started singing, it was clear that his confidence was much bigger than his talent. The judges exchanged tired glances. They had heard every excuse, every sob story, every promise that this time it will be different. But nothing changed. The voices all blended together into one forgettable blur. The production crew behind them had grown quiet too. They sat with their equipment, barely paying attention anymore. The sound engineers stared at their screens with blank expressions. Even the excited assistants who had been running around all morning were now sitting still, scrolling through their phones. This was supposed to be the moment when dreams came true. Instead, it felt like a waiting room where hope came to die. Turned to Robert and spoke quietly so the microphones wouldn't pick up her words. "I don't think we're going to find anyone today." Robert didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Diana heard them but chose not to join the conversation. She was still holding onto a small piece of hope, even though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe she was just too stubborn to give up. But something in her gut told her to wait, just a little longer. The assistant called the next number. An older woman walked in. She looked to be in her 60s, wearing a simple dress and carrying herself with quiet dignity. The judges sat up slightly, curious about this unexpected contestant. But when she started singing, it became clear that while her voice had probably been beautiful once, time had taken its toll. She struggled with the higher notes. Her breath control wasn't what it used to be. And though she sang with genuine emotion, it wasn't enough to overcome the technical problems. When she finished, Diana thanked her warmly and told her she had a lovely presence, nodded politely. Robert said nothing. The woman left the stage with her head held high, and the judges marked another name off their list. 7 contestants left. The afternoon sun was starting to fade outside the tall windows of the audition hall. The room felt heavier now, like the weight of all that disappointment had settled into the walls. Nobody expected anything anymore. The judges had given up. The crew had given up. Even the hopeful contestants waiting outside seemed to sense that something was wrong, their nervous chatter growing quieter with each passing minute. And then the assistant called the next number. The heavy double doors opened slowly. And what walked in would change everything. The waiting area outside the audition hall was packed with people. Some were packing back and forth, muttering lyrics under their breath. Others were doing vocal exercises, filling the air with strange sounds. A few sat in corners with their eyes closed, trying to calm their nerves before their big moment. But in the middle of all that chaos, sitting on a plastic chair near the back wall, was a little girl who seemed completely out of place. Her name was, and she had just turned 8 years old 2 weeks ago. She was small for her age, with dark brown skin and hair that had been carefully braided into 2 long plaits. She wore a yellow dress that had been washed so many times the color had started to fade. Her shoes were clean but old, and they didn't quite match her outfit. She sat between her grandmother and her older brother, swinging her legs back and forth because her feet couldn't reach the floor. While everyone around her seemed stressed and anxious, was humming softly to herself, looking around the room with curious eyes. Her grandmother's name was Ruth. She was 67 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and deep lines around her eyes that told the story of a long, hard life. Her hands were rough from years of work, but they held small fingers with the gentlest touch in the world. Ruth had raised since she was a baby. It wasn't supposed to be that way. Nobody plans to raise their grandchild, But life doesn't always go according to plan. His mother had passed away when was only 6 months old. She had been sick for a long time, and despite everyone's prayers and hopes, she didn't make it. Ruth still remembered that terrible day like it was yesterday. She remembered holding her daughter's hand in the hospital. She remembered the moment the machines went quiet. And she remembered looking at that tiny baby in the nursery, knowing that from that day forward it would be just the two of them. Well, the three of them, counting's brother. His name was David, and he was 16 now. He had been 8 years old when his mother died, old enough to remember her, old enough to miss her every single day. He had grown up fast after that, helping his grandmother around the house, working part-time jobs after school, doing everything he could to support their small family. Today, David sat on his other side, looking around the waiting room with a protective expression. He didn't like being here. He didn't like all these strangers looking at his little sister. But when had begged him to come, he couldn't say no. He never could. The three of them had driven 4 hours to get to Nashville. They had left their small town in rural Georgia before the sun came up, packing sandwiches and water bottles for the trip because they couldn't afford to stop at restaurants. Ruth's old car had made strange noises the whole way, and David had kept checking the temperature gauge nervously. But they made it. Against all odds, they made it. Ruth looked down at her granddaughter and felt her heart swell with love and worry at the same time. This audition was a big deal. There were professional singers here, people with training and expensive clothes and fancy backing tracks. What chance did a little girl from nowhere have against all of that? But then again, Ruth knew something that nobody else in that room knew. She knew what lived inside that child. She had heard it every Sunday morning for years. Had been singing before she could properly talk. Ruth still remembered the first time she noticed it. Was barely 2 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor while Ruth cooked dinner. The radio was playing an old gospel song, one of those slow, powerful hymns that Ruth had grown up with. And suddenly, Ruth heard something that made her stop stirring the pot and turn around. The baby was humming along. Not just random sounds, but the actual melody, perfectly in tune. Ruth had stood there frozen, wooden spoon in hand, tears forming in her eyes. Because that voice, even at 2 years old, sounded exactly like her daughter's. As grew older, her gift only became more obvious. She would sing along to the radio and hit notes that grown adults struggled with. She would stand in church on Sundays, this tiny little thing barely visible over the pew in front of her, and her voice would rise above everyone else's like it was the most natural thing in the world. People in their small town started to notice. The church choir director asked if could sing solo during special services. The elementary school music teacher called Ruth at home to tell her that her granddaughter had something rare and special. Neighbors would stop by just to hear the little girl sing while she played in the front yard. But Ruth never pushed her. She never signed her up for competitions or lessons or any of that. She just let be a child, let her sing when she wanted to sing, let her gift grow naturally like a flower reaching toward the sun. It was herself who had asked to come to this audition. She had seen a commercial for the talent show on television, and her eyes had lit up in a way Ruth had never seen before. "Grandma," she had said, tugging on Ruth's sleeve, "can I go try, please?" Ruth had hesitated. Nashville was far away. They didn't have much money, and the thought of her grandbaby standing in front of strangers, being judged and criticized, made her stomach turn. But then had looked up at her with those big brown eyes, so full of hope and innocence, and Ruth couldn't bring herself to say no. "All right, baby," she had said, "we'll go." Now here they were, surrounded by all these people who probably had more experience and more resources and more everything. Ruth squeezed his hand a little. "You nervous, baby?" she asked softly. Shook her head. Her braids swung back and forth with the movement. "No, Grandma, I'm okay." Ruth smiled, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. "You know, it doesn't matter what happens in there. Whatever those judges say, you're already a star to me. You know that, right?" nodded seriously. "I know, Grandma." David leaned over and ruffled his sister's hair gently. "You're going to do great, Squirt, and if anyone's mean to you, just tell me. I'll handle it." Giggled David. "You can't beat up the judges." "Watch me," he said, but he was smiling. The three of them sat there together, a small island of calm in a sea of nervous energy. Other contestants glanced at them curiously. Some probably wondered what a little kid was doing at a serious audition like this. Some probably thought it was cute but pointless. Nobody expected anything from the girl in the faded yellow dress. That was fine, wasn't thinking about any of them. She was thinking about her mama. Ruth had told her stories about her mother ever since she was old enough to listen. She knew that her mama had loved to sing, just like her. She knew that her mama had the most beautiful voice in the whole church, maybe in the whole town. She knew that her mama used to hold her and sing lullabies to her when she was a tiny baby, even when she was too sick to get out of bed. Didn't remember any of that, of course. She had been too young. But she carried those stories in her heart like precious treasures. And sometimes when she sang, she felt like her mama was right there with her, singing along. She reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and touched the small photograph she had hidden there. It was old and worn at the edges, a picture of her mother standing in front of their little church back home, smiling at the camera like she had all the happiness in the world. Ruth had given her that photo this morning, right before they left. "Take your mama with you," Ruth had said, pressing it into his palm. "Let her watch over you." Had nodded and tucked it safely away. She hadn't looked at it since, but just knowing it was there made her feel braver. A woman with a clipboard walked through the waiting area, calling out numbers. His number was coming up soon. She could feel it. Ruth noticed too. She turned to face her granddaughter fully, taking both of her small hands in her own rough, loving ones. "Listen to me, baby," Ruth said, her voice serious but warm. "When you get in there, don't think about those judges. Don't think about the cameras or the lights or any of that. You just sing like you sing at home. Sing like nobody's watching but God's listening. That's all you need to do." Looked into her grandmother's eyes and nodded slowly. "Sing like nobody's watching but God's listening," she repeated. "That's my girl." The woman with the clipboard called out another number, then another. Then Ruth kissed her forehead and whispered a quick prayer. David gave her a thumbs up and a wink, and stood up from her plastic chair, smoothed down her faded yellow dress, and walked toward the heavy double doors. She was 8 years old. She had no training, no backing track, no fancy outfit. All she had was her voice, her grandmother's love, and a photograph of her mama tucked close to her heart. The doors opened, and she stepped inside. The audition hall felt even bigger from the inside. The ceiling was high, the lights were bright, and the distance between the door and the stage seemed to stretch on forever. Stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking it all in with wide eyes. She had never been in a room this large before. Back home, the biggest space she knew was the church, and that could maybe fit 100 people if everyone squeezed together. This place could hold thousands. The empty seats rose up like mountains on either side, disappearing into shadows near the back. But didn't let herself feel scared. She remembered what her grandmother had said. Sing like nobody's watching but God's listening. She touched her pocket where the photograph of her mama rested, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet room. Click, 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 the sound of her old shoes against the polished floor. At the judge's table, nobody looked up at first, was rubbing her eyes, trying to fight off a headache that had been building for hours. Robert was staring at the wall, mentally calculating how much longer this misery would last. Diana was the only one who glanced toward the door, and when she saw who was walking in, her eyebrows rose slightly. A child, a little girl in a faded yellow dress. Diana nudged gently with her elbow, looked up, blinked a few times, and then her expression shifted to something between surprise and pity. Robert finally turned his attention to the stage as well, and his face remained completely blank. If anything, he looked even more tired than before. Great, he thought to himself. A kid, probably pushed here by parents who think their precious angel is the next big thing. This should be quick. Climbed the 3 small steps to the stage and walked to the center, where a single microphone stood waiting. The stand was too tall for her, so she had to look up at it awkwardly. One of the crew members rushed over and lowered it to her height, smiled at him and whispered a thank you. The judges watched this happen without much interest. They had seen nervous children before. They had seen stage parents living through their kids. They had seen tears and tantrums and everything in between. Nothing surprised them anymore. Robert cleared his throat. He didn't bother with a warm greeting or an encouraging smile. What was the point? This would be over in 2 minutes and they could move on to the next disappointment. "Name and song?" he asked flatly. Looked at him without any fear in her eyes. She didn't seem intimidated by his cold tone or by the massive room or by any of it. She just stood there, small and calm, like she belonged exactly where she was. "My name is," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I'm going to sing Amazing Grace." Managed a tired smile. She remembered being young once, remembered having dreams that felt bigger than the whole world. She didn't want to crush this child's spirit, even if the performance would probably be mediocre at best. "That's a beautiful song," said kindly. "A big song for a little girl. Are you ready?" Nodded, "Yes, ma'am." Diana leaned forward slightly. "Do you have a backing track, sweetheart? Some music to sing along with?" Shook her head. "No, ma'am, I'm just going to sing it regular, like I do at church." The judges exchanged glances. No music, no safety net, nothing to hide behind. Either this girl could really sing, or this was about to be very embarrassing for everyone. Robert waved his hand dismissively. "All right then, whenever you're ready." He picked up his pen, ready to make a quick note and move on, settled back in her chair. Diana kept her eyes on the little girl, something in her gut telling her to pay attention. Closed her eyes. The room went completely silent. Even the humming of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. The crew members who had been checking their phones looked up. The cameraman who had been adjusting his equipment stopped what he was doing. Everyone waited. And then opened her mouth and began to sing. The first note that came out was so pure, so unexpected, that it seemed to hang in the air like something you could almost touch. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was gentle, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Robert's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. He didn't notice. He couldn't notice. His entire being was focused on that voice, that impossible voice coming from that tiny girl on stage. "That saved a wretch like me." His hand flew to her chest. Her heart was pounding. In 30 years of discovering talent, she had heard beautiful voices. She had heard powerful voices. She had heard voices that could fill stadiums and voices that could sell millions of records. But she had never heard anything like this. "I once was lost, but now I'm found." Diana felt tears forming in her eyes before she even realized what was happening. The song was reaching inside her, pulling at something deep and hidden, something she had forgotten was even there. She thought about her own grandmother, who had passed away years ago. She thought about all the times she had heard this hymn as a child, sitting in a wooden pew with the sun streaming through stained glass windows. "Was blind, but now I see." His voice grew stronger with each word. It rose up from somewhere deep within her, filling the massive audition hall with a sound that seemed too big, too powerful, too full of soul to be coming from an 8-year-old child. There was no hesitation, no wavering, no technical errors, just pure, raw, breathtaking talent. The crew members behind the judges had stopped moving entirely. One woman had her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. A man who had been working in television for 20 years stood frozen, goosebumps running up and down his arms. The cameraman had the presence of mind to keep filming, but his hands were shaking. Wasn't just singing the song. She was living it. Every word carried weight, carried meaning, carried generations of faith and struggle and hope. Her small body swayed slightly as she sang, her eyes still closed, her face peaceful and focused. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Was crying openly now, tears running down her cheeks without any attempt to hide them. She had spent so many years in this business that she had become hard, cynical, difficult to impress. But this child had broken through all of that in less than a minute. This child had reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. "'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Robert hadn't moved since the first note. He sat completely still, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on the small figure on stage. In his mind, he was running through every artist he had ever worked with, every voice he had ever heard, trying to find something to compare this to. He couldn't. There was nothing. This was something entirely new. Diana gave up trying to hold back her emotions. She let the tears fall freely, let the music wash over her, let herself feel things she hadn't felt in years. She understood now why she had felt that strange pull all day, that instinct telling her to wait just a little longer. This was why. This moment. This girl. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. His voice soared on the high notes and dipped into the low ones with equal ease. There was no strain, no effort visible at all. It was like breathing for her. It was like she had been born to do exactly this, standing on exactly this stage, singing exactly this song. We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever, held it steady and true, letting it fade naturally until the room was wrapped in complete silence. Then she opened her eyes. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The judges stared at her like they were seeing something impossible. The crew behind them sat in stunned silence. The whole room felt different somehow, like something sacred had just happened within those walls. Stood quietly at the microphone, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting patiently for someone to say something. She didn't look nervous or proud or anything like that. She just looked like a little girl who had done what she came to do. The silence stretched on for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. And then the room exploded. Diana was the first one to move. She pushed back her chair so hard it nearly fell over, and she rose to her feet with her hands already coming together in applause. The sound of her clapping echoed through the silent hall like thunder breaking through a quiet sky. Followed half a second later, standing up so fast that she knocked her notebook to the floor. She didn't care. She didn't even notice. Her hands were clapping, her tears were still falling, and her heart was beating faster than it had in years. Robert was the last to stand, but when he did, it meant something. This was a man who almost never showed emotion. This was a man who had seen everything and been impressed by almost nothing. And now he was on his feet, applauding a little girl in a faded yellow dress like she had just performed the greatest concert of the century. Behind the judges, the entire production crew erupted. People who had been half asleep moments ago were now on their feet, clapping and cheering and wiping tears from their faces. Someone in the back shouted something that sounded like pure joy. A woman near the cameras was openly sobbing, not even trying to compose herself. The applause went on and on. It filled the massive audition hall from floor to ceiling, bouncing off the walls and washing over like a warm wave. She stood at the microphone, looking a little surprised by all the noise, her small hands still clasped in front of her. She hadn't expected this. She had just done what her grandmother told her to do. She had sung like nobody was watching, but God was listening. She didn't understand why everyone was crying. She didn't understand why they were all standing up. Was that a good thing? It seemed like a good thing. Diana was the first to find her voice. She was still clapping, but she managed to speak through her tears. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice cracking. "Oh my goodness, sweetheart." She couldn't say anything else. The words just wouldn't come. She pressed her hand against her chest and shook her head slowly, like she was trying to process what she had just witnessed. Reached for a tissue from the box on the table and dabbed at her eyes. Her makeup was ruined. She didn't care about that either. Nothing seemed to matter anymore except for the miracle standing on that stage. "Come here, baby," said, gesturing for to come closer to the judge's table. "Come here, please." Walked down the steps and across the floor until she was standing just a few feet away from the three judges. Up close, they could see how young she really was, how small, how ordinary she looked in every way except for that extraordinary gift living inside her. Robert finally sat back down. His legs felt weak. His hands were trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it by folding them on the table. He looked at with an expression that was completely different from the cold, bored look he had worn all day. "How old are you?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he was fighting to keep it steady. "8," answered simply. "I just turned 8 2 weeks ago." Robert nodded slowly. He glanced then at Diana, then back at the little girl in front of him. "I've been doing this for 30 years, he said. 30 years of listening to people sing. I've worked with some of the biggest names in music, Grammy winners, platinum artists, voices that sold out stadiums around the world." He paused and took a deep breath. "And I have never, in all that time, heard anything like what you just did." Blinked, she wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just said, "Thank you, sir." Leaned forward, her eyes still red from crying. "Sweetheart, where did you learn to sing like that? Do you take lessons? Do you have a vocal coach?" Shook her head. "No, ma'am, I just sing at my grandma's church, and at home sometimes. I never had any lessons." The judges exchanged looks of disbelief. No training, no professional help, just natural, God-given talent in its form. Diana wiped her eyes again and smiled it was a real smile, full of warmth and wonder. "Who taught you that song, honey? Amazing Grace. That's a very old, very special song." His face softened at the question. Her hand moved instinctively toward her pocket, where the photograph of her mother was hidden. "My grandma taught me," she said. "She plays old records on Sunday mornings, gospel music and hymns and stuff like that. I learned most of my songs from those records." Nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And is your grandma here today? Did she come with you?" "Yes, ma'am, she's outside in the waiting room. My brother, too. They drove me here all the way from Georgia." "Georgia," Robert repeated. "How far is that?" "About 4 hours, I think. We left really early this morning. Grandma packed sandwiches." Something about the way she said it, so simple and matter-of-fact, made his heart ache. This wasn't some privileged child with wealthy parents funding her dreams. This was a little girl whose grandmother had driven 4 hours and packed sandwiches because they probably couldn't afford to eat out. Diana leaned forward with a gentle expression. "Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Nodded, "Okay." "When you were singing up there, it felt like you were singing for someone specific. Was there someone you were thinking about?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Looked down at her shoes, then back up at Diana. Her big brown eyes were calm, but there was something deeper there now. Something that made her look older than 8. "I was thinking about my mama," she said quietly. The room seemed to grow even more still, if that was possible. "Your mama?" asked softly. "Is she here too?" Shook her head. "No, ma'am, my mama's in heaven. She died when I was a baby. I don't remember her, but my grandma tells me stories about her all the time." Diana pressed her hand over her mouth. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Even Robert looked away for a moment, his jaw tight with emotion. "Grandma says my mama could sing better than anyone," continued. She says when Mama sang in church, everybody would cry because it was so beautiful. Grandma says I sound just like her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn photograph. She held it up so the judges could see. This is her. My grandma gave it to me this morning. She said to take Mama with me so she could watch. Took the photograph gently, looked at it, and then passed it to Diana and Robert. They saw a young woman standing in front of a small country church, smiling at the camera, full of life and hope and dreams that would never be fulfilled. She's beautiful, Diana whispered. You look just like her. Smiled, that's what Grandma says too. Robert handed the photograph back to, and when their fingers touched briefly, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent so many years being cynical, being tough, being the judge that nobody could impress. But this child had done something to him. She had reminded him that music wasn't about record sales or fame or any of that nonsense. It was about moments like this. Real moments. Human moments. He cleared his throat and looked at his fellow judges. Nodded. Diana nodded. They didn't need to discuss it. They didn't need to debate. The decision was the easiest one they had ever made. Reached under the table and pulled out something shiny and golden. It was the ticket to the next round. The thing that every contestant had been hopping and praying for all day. She held it up so could see it. Do you know what this is, sweetheart? Asked. His eyes went wide. She had seen it on television. She knew what it meant. Is that for me? She whispered. All three judges smiled at the same time. It's for you, Diana said. You're going to the finals, baby girl. His face broke into the biggest smile any of them had ever seen. It was pure joy, pure happiness, the kind of smile that only a child can give. She bounced on her feet a little, unable to contain her excitement. Can I go tell my grandma? She asked eagerly. She's gonna be so happy. She's gonna cry probably. She cries a lot when she's happy. Robert actually laughed. A real laugh. The crew behind him looked shocked because most of them had never heard him laugh before. Yes, he said. Go tell your grandma. Tell her she raised something special. Tell her that what she's been protecting all these years is a gift that the whole world deserves to hear. Clutched the golden ticket to her chest and started running toward the doors. Then she stopped, turned around and looked back at the judges. Thank you, she said. Thank you for believing in me. And then she was gone, the sound of her small footsteps echoing through the hall as she ran to share the news with the only family she had ever known. The judges sat in silence for a long moment after she left. The crew was still wiping their eyes. The cameras were still rolling, capturing everything. Finally, Diana spoke. That, she said quietly, is why we do this job. And Robert nodded. They had been ready to give up. They had lost all hope. And then an 8-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress had walked in and reminded them what magic looked like. Ruth knew something had happened before even came through the doors. She could feel it in her bones, that strange knowing that comes from raising a child and loving them with every piece of your heart. The waiting room had grown quiet around her, and people were looking toward the double doors with curious expressions. Then those doors burst open and came running out. She was holding something golden in her hands, pressed tight against her chest. Her braids were bouncing. Her faded yellow dress was swirling around her knees, and her face was lit up with a smile so bright it could have powered the whole building. Grandma, she shouted, not caring that everyone was watching. Grandma, I did it, I did it. Ruth rose from her plastic chair, her old knees protesting but her heart soaring. She opened her arms just in time for it to crash into them, nearly knocking her backward. I got the golden ticket, Grandma. They said I'm going to the finals. They said I was special. Ruth held her granddaughter tight, so tight, like she was afraid she might float away if she let go. Tears were already streaming down her weathered face, falling into his braids. I knew it, Ruth whispered. I always knew it, baby, I always knew. David was on his feet too, standing behind his grandmother with the proudest look anyone had ever seen on a 16-year-old boy's face. When finally pulled back from Ruth's embrace, she turned and jumped into her brother's arms next. "David, did you hear me? I'm going to the finals." He lifted her up and spun her around once, laughing. "I heard you, Squirt. The whole building heard you. You're gonna be famous." "I don't want to be famous," said, suddenly serious. "I just wanted to sing for Mama. Do you think she heard me? Do you think she's proud?" David set her down gently and knelt so he was at her eye level. His voice was thick when he spoke. "She heard you," he said, "and she's the proudest mama in all of heaven right now. I promise you that." The other contestants in the waiting room had stopped their nervous practicing and their anxious packing. They were all watching this little family moment, some with jealousy, some with admiration, but most with something softer, something like hope. Because if this little girl from nowhere could walk in there and win over those tough judges, maybe there was hope for all of them too. One of the production assistants came through the doors a few moments later, looking around until she spotted and her family. She walked over with a warm smile. "Excuse me," she said to Ruth, "are you this young lady's guardian?" Ruth straightened up and wiped her eyes quickly. "Yes, ma'am, I'm her grandmother. The judges would like to meet you, if you have a moment. They were very moved by your granddaughter's performance." Ruth looked surprised. "Meet me, but I didn't do anything. She's the one with the gift." The assistant smiled. "They seem to think you had something to do with it. Would you follow me, please?" Ruth took's hand, and David followed close behind as they were led through the double doors and into the audition hall. The room was even bigger than Ruth had imagined. She had never been anywhere so fancy in her whole life. The three judges were still sitting at their table, but they all stood up when they saw Ruth enter. Was the first to approach, walking around the table with her arms already open. "You must be Grandma," said, pulling Ruth into a hug before she could even respond. Thank you for bringing her here today." Ruth was so overwhelmed she could barely speak. I just drove the car, ma'am. She's the one who did all the singing." Robert stepped forward next. His face was softer now, nothing like the stern judge had first seen. He extended his hand and Ruth shook it. "Ma'am, I've been in this business for 3 decades, he said. "I've worked with the best of the best. And I'm telling you right now, your granddaughter has something that can't be taught, something that can't be bought. You've been nurturing a rare gift, and the world is about to find out about it." Diana came over and took Ruth's other hand, holding it gently. "She told us about her mother, about how she passed when was just a baby. I'm so sorry for your loss." Ruth's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Thank you, honey. It was the hardest thing I ever went through, but God gave me this little angel to raise, and I've tried to do right by her every single day." "You've done more than right," Diana said. "You've done something beautiful." The family stayed for a few more minutes, talking with the judges, taking pictures, signing some paperwork about the finals. The whole time, held onto her grandmother's hand with one hand and her golden ticket with the other. When they finally left the building and stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine, it felt like walking into a different world. The parking lot was quiet. The sky was turning orange and pink as the sun began to set. Ruth's old car sat waiting for them, ready to make the 4-hour journey back home. But home felt different now. Everything felt different. They stopped at a gas station on the way back and bought sandwiches and drinks to celebrate. Got her favorite, a grape soda, and she sipped it happily in the back seat while David sat next to her. "Grandma," said after a while, her voice sleepy from all the excitement, "do you think things are going to change now?" Ruth looked at her granddaughter in the mirror. "What do you mean, baby?" "Like, are people going to treat us different? Are we going to have to move somewhere? I don't want to leave our house. I don't want to leave our church." Ruth smiled softly. "Baby, no matter what happens, you're still you. You're still my granddaughter. We're still a family. And we'll always have our little house and our church and everything that matters. Some things might change, but the important things never will. Seemed satisfied with that answer. She leaned her head against David's shoulder and closed her eyes, the golden ticket still clutched in her small fingers. Nobody knew it yet, but one of the crew members back at the audition hall had recorded his entire performance on his phone. He wasn't supposed to do that. It was against the rules. But he couldn't help himself. What he had witnessed was too special to keep locked away until the show aired months later. That night, after he got home, he uploaded the video to the internet with a simple caption. 8-year-old girl walks into audition and makes everyone cry. By morning, the video had 10,000 views. By noon, it had 100,000. By the end of the week, it had been watched over 10 million times. News stations picked up the story. Websites wrote articles about the little girl from Georgia who had sung Amazing Grace and brought a room full of hardened industry professionals to tears. People shared the video with their friends and family, posting comments about how it had made them cry, how it had restored their faith, how it had reminded them that real talent and real goodness still existed in the world. His face was suddenly everywhere. Her name was on everyone's lips. The girl in the faded yellow dress had become a symbol of hope. But back in their small town in Georgia, life went on mostly the same. Ruth still made breakfast every morning. David still went to school, still sang in church on Sundays, her voice rising above the congregation like it always had. The only difference was the pile of letters that started arriving at their mailbox. Letters from all over the country, all over the world. People wrote to tell how much her singing had meant to them. They wrote about their own losses, their own struggles, their own reasons for needing to hear a song about grace and redemption. Ruth read every single letter out loud to at the kitchen table, and every time would listen carefully, then ask if they could say a prayer for the person who wrote it. She was still just a child, still innocent, still pure. But she had already touched more lives than most people do in a lifetime. The finals were still weeks away. There would be more performances, more judges, more cameras, more attention. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for now, on this quiet evening in their little house in Georgia, none of that mattered. Ruth sat on the porch swing, watching the fireflies blink in the darkness of the front yard. Sat beside her, humming softly, her head resting against her grandmother's arm. Grandma whispered, "Yes, baby. Do you think Mama knows about everything that happened?" Ruth smiled and kissed the top of her granddaughter's head. "Baby, your mama was the first one cheering. I guarantee you that. She's been watching over you since the day you were born, and she's going to keep watching over you no matter where this journey takes you." Was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her yellow dress, pulled out the worn photograph, and looked at her mother's smiling face in the dim porch light. "I'm going to make you proud, Mama," she whispered to the picture. "I promise." Somewhere above them, the stars were shining bright, and if you listened very carefully, you could almost hear the sound of singing carried on the wind. A mother's voice joined by her daughter's. Together at last, if only in spirit. And this was just the beginning.